The protection of color of law from hate group activities is the functional confession directly to a hate group having infiltrated the United States government in order to implement the hate crimes expressed, and thus the function of history has demonstrated that the United States has been compromised by the white supremacists who will actively maintain their thieves' cans of misdirection about their criminal motives, which has actively maintained the Plato's conspiracy, maintaining the sexual options availability planned by the white supremacists in their communism of the sexual options, which has generated a series of rapes, which is the entire sexual market, which has manufactured the position of abortion rights concerning those who have been raped, which is each and every one of them, or the white supremacists wouldn't have allowed the sex to happen in the first place, and thus the right of abortions is founded on this conflict, and thus those who are in the super religious functions, such as the Christian church, who have actively been promoting anti abortion functions, would have to side against Christian nationalism, which is just Satanism wrapped in church, uh, in order to oppose the human trafficking for these functions, subverting J. Sekulo's war and its obtuse functions of being able to engage in these black markets for funding, which generates the rape culture, which generates the right of abortion, at which point they would attack the actual issue if they were anti abortion Christians, which the majority of them aren't. Most of them actively support it and wanted to reinforce the rapes and the byproducts of the rapes so that they can have social engineering coerced outcomes concerning the sexual market, at which point they engaging in their terrorist operations are just an advanced high school bully with terrorist operations, which evolves it from a regular nonsense bully into a war crime by a terrorist organization who have infiltrated the government and its associations, subcontracting the insurrection against the United States government for those capabilities and the permanent status and funding for white supremacy and for communism in their merger through the feudalist arrangements of the increased diversion of factions, have actively merged fascism with communism in their engagement for the maximized opposition to the United States, which they have labeled necessary force in order to conquer the states and subjugate them to the second federal government. And this generates their false justifications and their social engineering, such as, but it's not limited to, the function of Denzel Washington and many others who have pointed out that the problem when defects in the black community are cultural and not racial or any of the other things. At which point, the benefit of having conducted the wizard terrorism in order to traumatize them into the social engineered position, maiming their culture, has generated the cultural defects which cannot be solved while the terrorists are still in power, requiring national security to engage in the opposition of David's Confederate adversaries, forcing the duel and compelling an American Congress to give David the military to eradicate their population who support the terrorism, at which point the surrendering or being exterminated is the natural byproduct of national security, and these arrangements compelling martial law under David Boal's authority, who is the only justified party capable and competent enough under American authorities and law to have divided the correct activities for these procedures, which they've actively obstructed and frustrated for the extreme purpose of exacerbating the difficult nature of conducting such an operation fairly and impartially, which they would, in their Hegelian dialectic, exploit to the function of stating that it would be unfair that justice be conducted under conditions and precedents that they themselves had validated as fair and just. Consider the obvious. If something is criminal in a lower scenario, the more extreme version of the thing would by definition have to continue the criminal nature, and thus the position of a hate crime by a civilian organization not being a hate crime in the government is a contradiction of terms, is a custom without reason. They've changed the line of thinking in order to facilitate the protection and security of their insurgent double agents. The right to liberty is the right of self-determination and their control, and thus the function of no violation of the self-determined activities is being subverted by the activity of the war and the surveillance terrorism, where they actively refuse to submit crucial pieces of evidence for each of the justifications, including the function of their active smear campaigns in order to ramp up false legitimacy, to disrupt and dismantle order in favor of chaos, removing permanently from the United States Constitution and the rule of law under a due process and competent subordination to reason into the infinite political whims of whoever is arbitrarily contracting the terrorist operation and its subversion of society and its markets, which engineers the economic opportunities available, which derives the foundation of status, which is functionally being altered without due process under the harassment campaigns for the specific outcome of their communist arrangements, for the white supremacy under the subordination of the corruption of the United States into abject oblivion as they destroy the West. And if David loses the Civil War, then the United States will cease to exist, and there will no longer be a safe haven for liberty, which will make it permanently unattainable for all time throughout the posterity, which triggers the revelation government. And the revelation government, having restrained David as a prisoner under false pretenses, would be able to release David under his original title, which they would then be able to turn into the Antichrist arrangements. These functional changes as criminal acts of treason through the war efforts of the white supremacists has actively incorporated by its factions the various alternative stratagems of the other threats, such as their incorporation of the classical Soviet communism inside the United States government, which has used its tactics, which has been the foundation of much of the rape culture and the various threats of retaliation on the basis of their historic techniques concerning how they conduct their satanic spells. And these institutions, having systemically targeting all violations of David's ability to defend himself in the courts, has conducted sedition and contempt for court in the Congress, which is contempt for Congress, and all other means, including the court of public opinion, by the obstruction of David's national news corporations for his political party, which would have manufactured the political social media, which would have had the definitions which they were trying to censor so that they could elect by voter fraud the alternatives under the false pretenses of policies which reinforce and validate their changes to the American law, justifying their customs without reason, such as the foresworn or foretold answer of a hate group being able to do hate crimes, but the government, under color of law, is no longer conducting the same hate crime under the same activities for the same justifications, thus cleaning it by virtue of their ability to infiltrate the government. These crimes against humanity are against the entirety of the human race. This is not, under any circumstance, to be considered tolerable by any stretch of any imagination from any point of view, which requires their extreme malicious censorship and editing, which they have conducted against the United States public, in order to look even mildly cogent, which is already intolerably being violated by virtue of their unmitigated, unprofessional inherent nature as an unprofessional military. and that unprofessional militaries violated the original pretense concerning the construction of professional militaries, which is the act of extortions, rapes, and thefts against the general public, including the violation of the civilians' right to not have to host the soldiers in their homes, at which point this violation has actively led to destruction of property, which has substantively changed the nature and base conditions as their harassment campaigns and terrorisms and poisons has substantially changed the schedules, including the ability to maintain one's health so that they could create artificial vulnerabilities so that they can be poisoned, and under the persistent surveillance, harassment, and assaults, change the exercise, sleep, diet, and general maintenance conditions, such as the health conditions required in the maintenance of sexual behavior, and their ability to sustain their sexual engagements in a free society is an essential to maintain their health as their sexuality and their brain health, uh, which generates the output of mental health, which also generates the pretense concerning general performance, as everything you do is a reflection of your capacity of your brain to work properly, is actively maintained by these products, which is actively maintained by the harassment, which has in their communism centrally plans the output or demonstration, allowing them to conduct doodles or edits to the parties, subsequently changing the appearance, behaviors, and general interactions through these harassment in unfair conditions conducted by their contracted smear factories by the white supremacists. These economic terrorisms and social subversions by the white supremacist A group includes but is not limited to the active non-protection or interference by outside groups, such as Lindsey Graham's threats to other nations to not interfere in Confederate matters when conducting criminal operations against American civilians, which would have potentially led to the United States winning the Civil War by the compulsion of the duel and the siding with base reason and rationality, at which point those countries who are allies with peace treaties and mutual defense in time of war contracts would be invaded by the white supremacist controlled forces in order to retaliate them for the subjugation, which is the active maintenance and validation of the one world antichrist government, which they are manufacturing with extreme prejudice. As the competent ability to maintain law and order requires the ability to have uncovered the secret information held by the white supremacists engaged in the insurrection, the releasing of the information, which all of them actually possess, or many of them would have possessed, is essential to their peace agreement, as the Confederacy does not have a treaty with the other nations who are bound to the United States, such as through NATO. uh, these functions would actively be a violation of that peace treaty or mutual defense and time of war treaty, as the Confederacy engaged in a coup against America would be a threat of war against the United States, triggering their obligation of security against the insurrecting operation. And thus, the operation compels the release of the information in the procedure of order in order to justify military retaliation against David's abusers, who, by virtue of their hatred of God, country, and the human race, have no rightful place except for the eternal fires of hell, which is their society. If you peruse the source material, it should have the Beauty, Premium, and Ugly text by Aidan Paladin, which would actively maintain many of the specific pieces of information that they would be targeting in their criminal military operation against the United States. At which point, the function of their subversions and undermining would have the investigation demonstrate the substantive changes by their terrorist crimes, at which point there will be two different effects. One while the restrained party is incapable of conducting exercise or sleep, and one where they would be, and thus you compound these types of effects, which generate the completely different conditions, which have different results concerning the basic concepts at the foundation, such as appearance, which would generate the natural reactions, and thus the intention of a revenge X party, who, having seen in the original estimate that they would have been in a sexual relationship with David or others, who would not have acquired their goals, would actively seek retaliation and to create negative ugly doodles where they hire terrorists for retaliation in order to create these negative effects. At which point, the function of conducting this operation seeks to maximize the ugly tax, whereas the good faith investigation would demonstrate the beauty premium, which would have conducted the actual functioning effects. And thus, anyone who would actually be interested in the function would actively be maximizing the beauty premium in these abilities to maximize the numbers and all of the potential ramifications, which are systematically being undermined by a war of attrition for the eradication of all competent sense of order, justice, and rationality. Thus, when they conduct their various positions, the accusation becomes, but they targeted and abused the target, at which point, if the entire accusation is that they were a target, then there is no substantive justification towards any of the effects, and thus all of the negative consequences of being abused generates someone who's been bruised and bloodied and put in negative conditions, such as the ones in Unbroken, in the movie, which generates the less attractive version of the person who, having been subject to negative conditions in a war of attrition, has been exhausted infinitum into their least attractive version, making them the least capable of conducting the thing, while as the good faith investigation would demonstrate the highest attractiveness of the POW being able to be conducted into his Olympic grade athletics for the capacity of running in the movie Unbroken, would likely have overlapping functions to this, which generates the artificial diminished value for the communication, which is supposed to be the one that they are maximizing consumption of, which generates their pretense for the creation of the drunk notes, which is all of the videos from the hashtag WaronDavid and hashtag Confederate KKK WaronDavid and cites some such channels, which would generate these negative effects, as the drunk notes do not equal the function of a first draft, and not making a first draft does not make a second draft, and does not make a final draft. And thus, the obstruction of David's national news and its subordinate functions, such as through the brokerage, does not generate the capacity of that channel to be able to communicate under David's brokering abilities to have created the reporters and support staff for the communication of those for the final product and its viable conditions, as those who would have any opinion, including those who have an undesirable outcome opinion, who want the most unfavorable theories being distributed about him, would actively rely on those, which would have purchased it from their accounts, which would have had the assistance of David. At which point, one of the statements of communists, such as the character of Don Tribble, who would have actively stated that the American greed and capitalism would be the undoing of liberty in favor of communism, generating their absolute victory and domination over the United States by the suicidal nature inherent to capitalism, while exclusively referring to white supremacist communism and its companion fascism, and the fascist arrangements from the other parties, who, having predetermined who gets to be in which status, has determined who gets to be in the companies, which functionally is a looser connection of communism as opposed to an actual capitalist arrangement, which does have the negative defects of that arrangement. Now, in a free market, the truth is not afraid of the defamation, and thus the function of all negative images being communicated from that point of view with the proper resources without the obstructions is less sensitive to the issue, as the truth is not really afraid of being challenged. Lies are afraid of being challenged, is their foundational theory concerning this, which would have generated the Revenge X's, who are the actual supposed, they're the ones who are actually supposed to be the managers of the channel under the, what was it? The nonprofit for the Warren David, which would have compelled the proper representation of David Bowles for the duel, which generates the safe conditions of the release of the proper information essential to understand for the reports of David as the top-ranked general of intelligence oversight in order to deliver to Congress for a declaration of war against threats to the Constitution, which is these foundational problems. And at that manufactured outcome generate the subordination of the channel and its final profits into the nonprofit, which generates their ability to have compensated um, for their liabilities at the foundation, if not promote them. At which point, the more liabilities they would have, the more would be taken out of those as profits in favor of the nonprofit, generating the positive outcome of the United States being in control. And the less liabilities, the more take home profits that they would receive from their collaboration from the obligation of eminent domain, compelling them to conduct the services as payment for their criminal operations and spite for the United States and its conditions. And while they are highly attractive enough to have dated David, they are not attractive enough to have sustained the position despite the numbers, at which point the function of all of the arrangements uh, systemically proves that the short-term relationships are not long-term relationships, which generates the inherent nature of the retaliation, and thus the function of these positions requires their systemic confessions to the original estimate, which includes the functions of the retaliations and its natural byproducts, at which point the full description would have to consistently be generated from these drunk notes into the functional position, including the support text inside the comments and description, which generates the capacity of the other pieces of news, which are essential to understand in their appropriate order, which manufactures our capacity to engage in a fair and competent conversation, as the pretext of their fraud neutralizes the capacity to engage in an agreement on the definition of terms, which prevents the capability of making a conversation in good faith, which is actively conducted by secret conversations out of context, which has actively been fed false information, which requires the terms and services to uh, conduct the FAQ, frequently asked questions concerning the misinformation commonly spread by the terror factories smear factory, which generates the products of their criminal war and its efforts and its campaigns at the multidimensional warfare in order to subvert the competent stability of the court of public opinion as they manufacture compulsions of making David a public figure, which would not have originally been conducted under their own theory, which generates the negative pretense for our obligation to engage in these systemic steps in order to manufacture a competent conversation, including the function of not replacing David with the second party and the average person chosen by the courts in order to prevent the capability of them to say that their fraud was viable, created unfair conditions that the average person picked by the courts cannot succeed through, is functional fraud, which cannot be held against David, which is actively being conducted by those conditions and other parties picked for that to be demonstrated by those other parties, which is actively negatively impacting David's image from those conversations, which generates the pretense of their hyper subversion, which generates negative reactions for their various gimmicks and clippings, at which point their ability to engage in that function of fraud generates the negative compounding defects for the capability of a fair, competent exchange, which stops the pretense of the ability to have a conversation in good faith without it being hyper polluted for the exacerbation of all parties who would receive their own secret subversion, which, going past all of the other functional positions, uh, is a harassment campaign against them. And the harassment campaign against them, supposed to be taxed against David, generates criminal byproducts for our obligation to solve for the public peace and stability. We have to engage in the subversion of the public harassment campaigns, as the public nuisance generated by these terrorist operations compounds to an exponential degree by the creeps who support it.